January 1st, 2013. A highway patrol officer pulls over on a freezing, desolate stretch of a rural Ontario highway. He sees a white Pontiac Grand Prix parked awkwardly on the shoulder. It looks like a completely routine assist, but when the officer approaches the stranded couple standing outside the car, he notices something disturbing. The young guy's hands are severely injured, heavily wrapped in makeshift medical tape and crude bandaging. The officer calls for an ambulance, thinking he's just helping out some unlucky folks in a bad situation. He does his job, completely unaware of who he is actually talking to. He has no idea that while he's making that call, the parents of a 27-year-old kindergarten teacher are frantically dialing the police, terrified out of their minds. And he has absolutely no idea that the broken-down car he is standing next to holds the darkest, most twisted secret this community has ever seen. This is the story of Noelle Paquette, a woman whose absolute passion in life was helping children. Sarnia, Ontario, a quiet Canadian border city right across the water from Michigan. It's a blue-collar community, driven heavily by petrochemical plants and modest, hard-working neighborhoods. On December 31st, 2012, 27-year-old Noelle Paquette was doing exactly what millions of other people were doing, celebrating New Year's Eve. She was at a party in an apartment above a restaurant in downtown Sarnia. Her boyfriend was there. Her friends were there. Drinks were flowing, music was playing, and everyone was counting down to midnight. But somewhere in that same city, two other people were spending their New Year's Eve very differently. They weren't toasting to new beginnings. They were hunting. To truly understand the weight of what happened next, you need to know who Noelle Paquette was. Noelle was a kindergarten teacher. She worked at St. Matthew Catholic Elementary School, covering a temporary maternity leave. Now, St. Matthew's wasn't located in the wealthiest part of town. The school served a neighborhood that dealt with significant poverty. A lot of these kids came from homes where money was incredibly tight, where dinner wasn't always a guarantee, and where getting a new winter coat was considered a luxury. And Noelle, she noticed, she wasn't the kind of teacher who just showed up, read a lesson plan, and clocked out. Every single day, Noelle packed 2 lunches before she left for work, one for herself and one for a 5-year-old student she knew couldn't afford to eat. Think about the heart that takes. A teacher on a temporary contract, quietly doubling her own grocery bill just to make sure a little kid wouldn't have to go hungry. But she didn't stop there. Noelle and a colleague named Kyle started quietly collecting donations, gathering food, clothing, and basic supplies for struggling families. There was no big fundraiser with a fancy name. She didn't post about it on social media for likes. It was just 2 teachers filling up bags, because they believed it was the right thing to do. Outside of school, her life was finally coming together. She had recently purchased her very first home in Corunna, a small community about 20 minutes outside of Sarnia. At 27, she was building a beautiful life. Fast forward back to the night of December 31st. Noelle is at that New Year's Eve gathering above Adam's Apple. Everything is completely normal. But sometime around 2 a.m., Noelle and her boyfriend get into an argument. The exact details of what they fought about don't really matter. What matters is the decision she made next. Upset and wanting to clear her head, Noelle decides to leave the party, on foot, alone. In the dead of winter, during the early, freezing hours of New Year's Day, a friend actually tried to stop her. He walked with her for several blocks, doing his best to convince her to come back inside, or at least let someone give her a ride. But Noelle was frustrated, and she insisted on walking. Eventually, her friend turned back toward the party, and Noelle continued alone into the cold, dark streets of Sarnia. As she walked, she was texting her boyfriend. It was an angry, back-and-forth exchange, the kind of heated texting that happens during any normal couple's fight. But those messages would later become a crucial digital breadcrumb trail. The timestamps told investigators exactly when Noelle was still alive, still moving, and still okay. And then, at roughly 2:30 in the morning, the texts abruptly stopped. Her phone went completely silent. Here is a detail that would later prove critical for detectives. Sometime around 2:30 a.m., a witness reported seeing a man following a woman who matched Noelle's description. But another witness saw something completely different. They saw a white sedan pull up alongside a young woman on the desolate street, and they watched that woman willingly open the door and get into the car. A white sedan. Keep that in mind. But before we talk about what happens when those car doors close, we need to hit pause. We need to rewind just a little bit and look at who else is awake in Sarnia that night. And more importantly, who exactly is sitting inside that white sedan. Because what nobody knew yet was that this wasn't some random crime of opportunity. This wasn't a tragic mugging gone wrong. This was a story about two deeply disturbed individuals who found each other, fed off each other's darkest impulses, and spent months meticulously building toward exactly what happened on New Year's Day. Meet Michael McGregor and Tanya Bogdanovich. Michael was just 19 years old, barely out of high school, at an age when most young guys are stressing about college applications or working part-time jobs. McGregor was heavily active on dark fringe online platforms, exploring interests that strayed far beyond the realm of normal intimacy. Tanya Bogdanovich was 31. She was 12 years older than McGregor. She was a registered practical nurse, a licensed healthcare professional whose literal job was to care for people. She was a mother to 3 children, and at the time of all this, she was actually living with her long-term common-law partner. On paper, she looked like a completely functional, responsible adult living a perfectly normal domestic life. She had a career, a family, and real-world responsibilities. But Tanya was living a chilling double life. There was a pitch-black side to her that no one, not her co-workers, not her friends, and certainly not the man she lived with, could have possibly recognized. Tanya and Michael met in June of 2012 on an online platform specifically catering to extreme and disturbing online subcultures. Now, what consenting adults choose to do in their private lives is their own business. But this case isn't about healthy, consensual exploration. It's about what happens when two specific predators collide and how rapidly their dynamic escalated from digital fantasy into real-world violence. Within weeks of meeting online, McGregor and Bogdanovich began exchanging intense messages. Initially, Bogdanovich liked to take the lead. She would frequently ask McGregor to engage in extreme, dark role-play with her. She wanted him to act out aggressive fantasies that most people wouldn't even be comfortable typing out, let alone doing. But then, the dynamic shifted. By the fall of 2012, roughly 3 to 4 months into their relationship, their conversations completely evolved. They were no longer talking about what they wanted to do to each other. They started talking about what they wanted to do to someone else. Specifically, they began discussing a horrific plan involving an unwilling third party. By September 2012, they weren't just throwing around edgy hypotheticals. They were texting each other concrete, actionable plans. They talked about how to identify potential victims, how they would physically overpower them, where they would drive them, and exactly what they would do once they were completely isolated. And as the weeks ticked by toward the end of the year, the fantasy grew darker. They started talking about taking a life. According to the actual text messages recovered by investigators later on, the couple laid out a chilling sequence of events. They would take a woman against her will, subject her to unthinkable cruelty, and ultimately commit the final crime. It was a step-by-step rehearsal, a script. They had been writing it together for months, refining it over thousands of texts. And here is where the story takes a turn that makes it even harder to stomach. They actually had an original target picked out for New Year's Eve. They weren't planning to just grab a random person off the street. They had a specific woman in mind. 2 adults had spent weeks actively planning to abduct, harm, and permanently silence this specific individual on New Year's Eve. But for whatever reason, on the night of December 31st, that woman was unavailable. Maybe she was home with her family. Maybe she changed her plans. But the fact remains, she was safe. Their primary target fell through. But McGregor and Bogdanovich didn't just call it a night and go home. They were already out. The adrenaline was already pumping. They had been building toward this crescendo for half a year. So, sitting in Tanya's white Pontiac Grand Prix, they went looking for a substitute, a plan B. This brings us right back to 2:30 in the morning, Sarnia's desolate, freezing streets. Noelle Paquette is walking alone, shivering in her coat, texting her boyfriend. Tanya Bogdanovich and Michael McGregor are cruising the streets like predators looking for prey. And that is exactly when they spot her. A lone figure walking down the sidewalk. Here is what investigators believe happened next. Tanya Bogdanovich is the one behind the wheel. She pulls the white sedan over to the curb, right alongside Noelle, and rolls down the window. Now, pause and think about this from Noelle's perspective for a moment. It's 2:30 a.m. It's the middle of a harsh Ontario winter, well below freezing. She's been walking for a while. She's emotionally drained from the argument, and a car pulls up. If a creepy 19-year-old guy had rolled down that window, Noelle would have bolted. She was a smart, capable woman. Every instinct would have told her to be on high alert. But that wasn't the face looking back at her. The person offering her a warm ride home was a smiling 31-year-old woman, a nurse, a mother. How threatening does that really feel? Any of us would have let our guard down. Any of us would have thought, "Oh, thank God, this good Samaritan is going to help me get out of the cold." That was the psychological brilliance of their predatory teamwork. Bogdanovich was the ultimate bait. Noelle opens the door and gets into the white Pontiac, but the second those doors shut, the trap is sprung. Bogdanovich doesn't drive her home. Instead, she drives to a pre-arranged dark location where Michael McGregor is waiting in the shadows. He gets into the vehicle, and then they hit the gas, driving in the exact opposite direction, out of Sarnia, away from the streetlights, away from the houses, and deep into the isolated rural darkness of Lambton County. They drive for roughly 20 to 25 kilometers. Imagine what it must have been like for Noelle in that back seat, watching the familiar city lights disappear, realizing the roads are getting darker and more remote, the terrifying, suffocating moment when the realization sets in that this is not a ride home. They finally stop the car in a heavily wooded area. It is desolate, deserted, pitch black, the kind of place where you could scream at the top of your lungs and absolutely no one would hear you. They forced Noelle out into the snow, and right there, in the freezing woods, they do exactly what they had spent months planning. I am not going to describe every harrowing detail here, because Noelle deserves to be remembered for how she lived, not just how she passed. But to understand the sheer level of evil we are dealing with, you need to know this. Noelle fought back. She fought for her life, but she was overpowered. The medical examiner's report would later reveal the devastating reality of that night, showing that Noelle had been subjected to a relentless attack with a knife. The attack was completely devastating, but the most chilling detail investigators uncovered was the sheer cruelty of what happened in those woods. Inflicting that kind of damage isn't a quick, impulsive crime of passion. It takes physical effort. It takes time. The attack was so frantic and reckless that in the chaos of the struggle, McGregor ended up severely injuring his own hands. When the frenzy was finally over, they left her there. A woman whose life was defined by kindness. A teacher who bought double lunches for hungry kids, left lifeless in the freezing brush. Tanya and Michael got back into the white Pontiac Grand Prix. They were covered in the grim reality of what they had just done, breathing heavily, and Michael's hands were deeply injured. But they had done it. They had crossed the line. Now, all they had to do was drive away, clean up the car, and seamlessly blend back into their everyday lives. So, Tanya puts the car in drive, pulls out of the woods, and heads down the rural highway to make their getaway. Tanya Bogdanovich and Michael McGregor are speeding down the dark rural highway, pumped full of adrenaline. They probably felt invincible. They had just pulled off the perfect crime. No witnesses, a random victim, no obvious connection to them. All they had to do was make it home. But this is where the universe steps in. And I mean it. If you believe in fate, or karma, or divine intervention, this is the exact moment to point to. As they are driving, the white Pontiac Grand Prix starts making a terrible noise. It starts sputtering. And right there, on a deserted stretch of Highway 402, the engine completely seizes up. The car dies. They had spent 6 months meticulously planning the ultimate crime. They had a dark web manifesto. They thought of every single detail, every twisted fantasy, except for one. Bogdanovich hadn't checked her car's oil. The engine literally blew up because it ran out of oil. They are suddenly hopelessly stranded on the side of a freezing rural highway, just a short distance from where they had just destroyed the life of an innocent woman. They can't run. They can't hide. They are stuck. They frantically attempt to clean the car. They wipe down the surfaces, trying to eliminate the physical evidence. But you can't just wipe away DNA. And you definitely can't explain away the knife sitting right there on the driver's side floorboard. And this brings us right back to the beginning of our story. An Ontario Provincial Police OPP officer is conducting a routine patrol when he spots the disabled white Pontiac parked awkwardly on the shoulder. The hazard lights are off, the hood is popped open. He pulls over to do his job, to help some stranded motorists. When the officer walks up to the couple, he immediately notices something is very wrong. The 19-year-old guy's hands are severely injured, wrapped in thick makeshift bandaging that had clearly been put together in a panic. Now, let me put this into context. When this officer pulled up behind that disabled car, Noelle Paquette had not yet been officially broadcasted as a missing person. Nobody was connecting the dots yet, simply because nobody knew there were any dots to connect. The officer, seeing the severe state of McGregor's hands, assumes it's just a major medical emergency. He immediately calls an ambulance, and both individuals are transported to a local hospital for treatment. But the clock is already ticking. The sheer speed of this investigation is something worth noting. In many cases like this, stranger-on-stranger crimes where there is zero prior connection between the victim and the perpetrators, it can take months or even years to identify suspects. Sometimes these cases go cold forever. But McGregor and Bogdanovich essentially handed themselves to the police on a silver platter. When the sun came up on New Year's Day, Noelle's parents' standard worry had mutated into sheer panic. They contacted the police, and the heavy machinery of a major missing persons investigation started spinning up. But this wasn't just a police effort. As the news of the beloved kindergarten teacher's disappearance spread, the entire community of Sarnia mobilized. Friends, family, and ordinary citizens flooded the streets, printing flyers and organizing search grids. Detectives frantically retraced her steps, pulling CCTV footage from downtown and tracking the timestamps on those final text messages she sent to her boyfriend. For 24 agonizing hours, everyone held on to the desperate hope that Noelle had just sought shelter from the freezing cold and lost her phone. But that hope was shattered the following day. On the morning of January 2nd, around 10:30 a.m., a police search team combing a desolate rural area miles outside of town made the horrific discovery. They made the tragic discovery deep in that frozen, isolated woodlot. Once Noelle was positively identified and the manner of her passing was established, detectives began working backward with blinding speed. They had the witness statements from downtown Sarnia about a white sedan pulling up alongside a young woman matching Noelle's description. And then, the OPP patrol officer's report came in. A disabled white Pontiac Grand Prix found on a rural road near the crime scene, and a 19-year-old guy with severe defensive-style injuries on his hands. It didn't take a genius to connect those dots. All roads led straight back to the stranded white Pontiac on Highway 402. The vehicle was immediately impounded and processed. Inside, crime scene technicians found obvious physical evidence, despite the criminals' sloppy attempts to clean it up. The knife recovered from the floorboard was perfectly consistent with the attack in the woods. DNA evidence officially linked the vehicle and its occupants to the crime scene in the woods. On January 3, 2013, barely 48 hours after Noelle took her last breath, heavily armed police located Michael McGregor and Tanya Bogdanovich in London, Ontario, about 2 hours east of Sarnia. Both were arrested and charged with the ultimate offense of taking her life. The very next day, McGregor made his first court appearance. The image broadcasted on the local news was striking: a 19-year-old kid standing awkwardly before a judge, with both of his hands heavily wrapped in thick medical splints and bandages, injuries he sustained during his unthinkable act against a defenseless woman. But while the physical evidence was an absolute slam dunk, the digital evidence was the real goldmine. When investigators obtained search warrants for the phones and computers belonging to McGregor and Bogdanovich, what they found was sickening. Detectives sifted through thousands of text messages. This is how they discovered the escalating violent fantasies. This is how they learned about the original target, the specific woman who was miraculously saved by a change of plans. These messages proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that this wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a drunken mistake or two people who snapped under extreme pressure. This was cold, calculated, premeditated destruction of a life. For months, McGregor and Bogdanovich had been building toward this moment like it was an upcoming vacation they were looking forward to. These messages painted a picture that no slick defense attorney could ever explain away to a jury. The evidence was an absolute mountain, and the case officially moved toward trial. Or rather, it moved toward a grueling, agonizing test of endurance for the Paquette family. Here is a harsh reality about the Canadian justice system that often frustrates the public and absolutely devastates the families of victims. It moves slowly, agonizingly slowly. Michael McGregor and Tanya Bogdanovich were arrested in January 2013, but the case didn't resolve quickly. For nearly 3 years, the legal machine ground forward at a glacial pace. There were pre-trial motions, massive disclosures of evidence, court dates that were set, only to be delayed and rescheduled. Put yourself in the Paquette family's shoes for a moment. For 3 long years, Noelle's parents, Lynn and Roger, had to wake up every single morning knowing that the 2 monsters who destroyed their daughter's life were sitting in jail cells. Yes, but that justice hadn't actually been served yet. There was no verdict, no final sentence, just endless, suffocating waiting. The psychological toll on the family was catastrophic. Lynn Paquette, Noelle's mother, was diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress disorder and clinical depression. This was the kind of trauma that literally rewires your brain, the kind that strips away your ability to function normally and makes you terrified of the world. Both parents were forced to live in the exact same community where their daughter had been hunted. Everywhere they looked in Sarnia, there was a ghost. But here is what the Paquette family chose to do during those 3 dark years of waiting, and I think it tells you absolutely everything you need to know about who Noelle was. They started a charity. They called it Noelle's Gift. Remember what we talked about at the very beginning of this video? How Noelle used to pack 2 lunches every single day, one for herself and one for a little kid who couldn't afford to eat? The Paquettes took that beautiful spirit and turned it into something permanent. Noelle's Gift was created specifically to support children and families in the exact same marginalized communities Noelle had served as a teacher. The community rallied behind the family in a way no one could have anticipated. What started as a grieving family's way of honoring their stolen daughter became a massive, life-saving operation. Today, the organization distributes hundreds of thousands of dollars in a single year, providing hot meals, winter coats, and school supplies to kids in need. The Paquettes could have easily retreated into the shadows. They could have been entirely consumed by bitterness, anger, and a blinding desire for revenge. Instead, they channeled that agony and built a beacon of hope. Every single child who eats a hot lunch because of that program. That is Noelle. That is her legacy. But while the charity was changing lives, the legal clock was still ticking. The family still needed a resolution. And finally, the case reached its breaking point. As the end of 2015 approached, everyone in Sarnia was bracing for what was sure to be a grueling, highly publicized, and deeply traumatic trial. But there would be no trial. Completely bypassing the need for a jury, both Michael McGregor and Tanya Bogdanovich looked at the suffocating mountain of evidence against them, the DNA, the forensic evidence in the car, and their own digital archive of sick plotting, and officially entered guilty pleas. Going to trial would have simply meant broadcasting every disturbing evidence photo to the public, only to arrive at the exact same inevitable outcome. But a guilty plea doesn't mean the gavel simply drops and everyone goes home. The court still needed to go through the formal sentencing phase. Victim impact statements had to be read. February 11, 2016. It had been more than 3 years since Noelle Paquette vanished into the winter night. The courtroom was packed to the absolute brim. The Paquette family, local media, and members of the community filled the gallery. And sitting at the defense tables were Michael McGregor, now 22 years old, and Tanya Bogdanovich, now 34. Before the judge made his final ruling, both defendants were given the opportunity to address the court. Michael McGregor stood up first. He turned his body to face the Paquette family, looked at them, and said, and this is a direct quote, "I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it." Those are heavy words, but I ask you, do you actually believe him? Do you believe that a man who spent months eagerly texting his girlfriend about hunting and destroying an innocent woman, a man who drove 25 kilometers into the freezing woods to commit such an unspeakable act against a defenseless person, is genuinely remorseful? Or is he just sorry that his car broke down? Then Tanya Bogdanovich spoke. During her statement, she referred to what happened as a horrendous tragedy. A horrendous tragedy. Think about that word choice for a second. An earthquake is a tragedy. A tragic accident implies a complete lack of control. But what happened to Noelle wasn't a tragedy. It was a choice. Hundreds of choices, actually, made over the course of 7 months. Every text message, every turn of the steering wheel brought them closer to that frozen field. Her defense attorneys attempted to point to her deeply troubled past, explaining she had endured severe personal trauma earlier in her life, which ultimately warped her psyche. And look, a history of deep psychological trauma is undeniably devastating. But millions of people survive unimaginable hardships without deciding to destroy the lives of innocent strangers. A dark past might explain behavior, but it absolutely does not excuse it. When it was finally time for the presiding judge, Justice Bruce Thomas, to speak, he did not hold back. He looked down from the bench at Michael McGregor and Tanya Bogdanovich, and he described their actions using 2 very specific words: vile and despicable. He didn't say unfortunate. He didn't say regrettable, vile, and despicable. He then officially dropped the gavel, handing down the absolute maximum penalty allowed under Canadian law. For the horrific, premeditated crime against Noelle Paquette, Michael McGregor and Tanya Bogdanovich were each sentenced to life in prison, with absolutely no possibility of parole for 25 years. Noelle Paquette was just 27 years old. She spent her entire life trying to help kids who had nothing, and she's still doing it today.